Lucy Letby is accused of the murder of
7 babies and the attempted murder of 10 others.
While she was working on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Letby denies all of the charges over the incident.
Lucy Letby was the only person working on the night shift. It was alleged in court that their mother was apparently told by Miss Letby, "Trust me, I'm a nurse."
Just over 9 months ago, the trial of Lucy Letby began. She was accused of the most shocking of crimes, the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 10 others. She always denied all the charges.
I'm Liz Hull, Northern correspondent for the Mail.
And I'm Caroline Cheetham, a broadcast journalist.
I was in court every day watching the trial unfold, and together we created our podcast, The Trial of Lucy Letby. We examined what happened and brought you the details behind the headlines, allowing you to be part of each moment of the trial. The podcast was groundbreaking because it was the first time in the UK that a podcast had covered a live trial week by week.
You listened in your millions, and now we're going to bring you the inside story of what happened during the trial and how the jury reached their verdicts.
This is the trial of Lucy Letby, the inside story.
This story starts back in 2015. Back then, David Cameron was Prime Minister, Facebook got 1 billion users, NASA found water on Mars, and almost 700,000 babies were born in the UK. 3,000 of them were born at the Countess of Chester Hospital in the northwest of England. But over the next 12 months, from June 2015 to June 2016, it slowly became apparent something unthinkable might be happening.
Doctors noticed that there was a sudden spike in deaths and near deaths on the neonatal unit, where premature and poorly babies are cared for, so they started to investigate. When they failed to find a medical reason, police were eventually called in, and after an investigation lasting for more than a year, they arrested a young Band 5 nurse who had worked at the hospital for several years.
In November 2020, Lucy Letby was charged with the murder and attempted murder of 17 babies.
And, after deliberating for 22 days, the jury found Lucy Letby guilty of the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital in Cheshire. She will go down as the most prolific child killer in British history.
So Liz, from the minute we started work on this podcast, which was back in October last year, we had the whole families of every baby at the forefront of our mind. The mums and the dads, the cousins, the aunties, the uncles, the brothers and the sisters. Because we knew we had to do this right. They thought their child had died or been hurt or been poorly because of natural reasons, natural causes. And the first they knew that this was something much more sinister was, for some of them, 5 years on, when they got a knock on the door from Cheshire Police.
Yeah,
you
can't imagine, really horrendous. And then a lot of them obviously had to give statements to the police, and some of them came to court themselves to give evidence and had to listen to the most awful details about what happened to their child.
Nurse came up and asked whether I wanted someone to call a priest. I remember feeling quite shocked, and I asked if she thought he was going to die. She responded, "Yes, I think so."
When we got there, she was in intensive care with all the machines. It was such a shock. She looked like she was going to die.
Our daughter could go from perfectly fine to nearly dying in seconds. There was no in between. Our daughter seemed to deteriorate when we left her alone, and predominantly at night.
I was praying to my God to see my boy and help him. I was asking my God to save him. My husband was not saying anything, but he was crying and crying.
We made the decision to switch off the machines and let her go. It was by far the hardest decision of my life. Our daughter was in my husband's arms when she took her last breath and silently passed away.
That audio is so hard to listen to, isn't it? Because they were the actual words of the parents who gave evidence to this court, either in person, just 2 of them did, or in statements. And for the podcast, as you know, Liz, we got them voiced up by actors because one of the things we wanted to do on the podcast was to take our listeners into that courtroom, to try to put them where we were.
And to kind of put across the emotion of it being in there. You know, some of these, I'm a mum, you know, some of these mums had to get up there and describe what they'd seen and what had happened to their child. And obviously Lucy Letby is in the room. Yeah, she's in the room as well. And a courtroom is quite a scary place as well. You know, if you're not used to being in a courtroom, they're austere places.
I mean, the other thing as well is that this was the first time these parents knew what Lucy Letby had allegedly done to the other children in this trial.
Yeah, they couldn't draw the dots until they were actually there and watching, and you know, that moment of realisation of, you know, the full extent of the case must have been pretty horrendous.
So Liz, from the moment the jury was sworn in, that's the jury of 8 women and 4 men for this case, which was in October last year, they were told it was going to be a long trial. I think they were told it was going to be probably 6 months. They didn't know they were going to give up probably the best part of a year of their lives, but they were also told it was going to be complex. And how complex was it? I mean, I've got the figures. We're talking about 5,500 police statements. We're talking about 32,200 exhibits and more than 13,000 pages of audio transcripts. And all that related to Lucy Letby, who faced 22 charges relating to 17 babies.
Yeah, but actually, Caroline, nobody will ever know the identities of these babies that really should be at the centre of the trial. They were at the centre of the trial. And that's because of the strict reporting restrictions that were on the case to protect their identities and the identities of their families.
So we would call them Baby A to Q.
Yeah, that's right.
What we do know is what Lucy Letby did. The way that she attacked the babies, her modus operandi. We know how she attacked them. We'll never know why she attacked them. She had a number of techniques. She used insulin to poison. Yeah. She also tried to smother. One child had a really serious, violent liver injury, but she had one particular method.
Well, the prosecution said that her favourite method of killing and harming these babies was injecting them with air, and that caused an air bubble or an air embolus in their bloodstream, which blocked the blood flow and essentially killed them that way. Now, we don't really know what triggered this kind of killing spree that she went on, but we do know that she went on a course which taught her how to deal with long lines and injecting medicine into certain cannulas, and prosecution speculated that maybe that was what taught her about air embolus, and that's when she went on to kill baby A a couple of weeks later.
2 weeks before the death of baby A, Lucy Letby completed a course relating to intravenous lines, and on the course, the dangers of air embolus were mentioned. Is that just a coincidence, or is that what gave her the idea? We will never know. We say Lucy Letby killed baby A with an injection of air into the bloodstream. When he collapsed, she was standing over him. She tried the same thing with his sister the following night, but miraculously she survived.
So baby D was another child that was injected with air. She was the 3rd baby to die in a fortnight in June 2015, and she was actually the only baby in the case that was full term. She wasn't premature, and the reason she was there was because her mum had had a really long and difficult labour. She'd been in labour for 60 hours, and the doctors thought that she had an infection when she was born because she was having a few problems breathing. So that's the reason she was in the neonatal unit.
Yeah, because it catered mainly for premature
resuscitator, they noticed this strange discoloration on her abdomen and on her tummy, and this rash, this kind of purpley, blotchy rash, became quite a feature of the case.
Well, and actually, a lot of the doctors and nurses didn't know what it was. They'd never seen something like that before. The sort of flitting, they called it, flitting rash that sort of moved and came and went. And they didn't know, what was causing it, and they didn't know why it was affecting, well, this baby, but then as it turned out,
more babies.
More babies. So baby E's mum also gave evidence in person to the court, didn't she? And again, a sort of traumatic moment in the courtroom. But what happened in her case was that she was never meant to be at the Countess. She was meant to have her twins at Liverpool Women's because there was a condition that had been diagnosed and they were better there. But when she went into labour, there were no beds. So she and her husband drove the 30 miles to the Countess of Chester to have the twins there. And the reason we've chosen this as a key moment in the podcast was because this was one of the moments that Lucy Letby was interrupted attacking one of the twins.
And on this evening, it was a couple of days after the boys had been born, and their mother was on her own actually in the hospital recovering from a caesarean, and her husband had actually gone home because it was anticipated that the boys were going to go or be transferred to a hospital nearer their home to be cared for.
Because they were doing well.
Because they were doing well.
Yeah.
And so in the evening of the 3rd of August, she'd been down to see
And when baby E's mum actually went into the room, to the cot, to see him, now he had blood around his mouth at that point and she was really worried. But she went back to the ward because Lucy Letby told her to. But later, when he collapsed and doctors were trying to save him, this bleeding got worse and worse.
Yeah, and one of the doctors also noticed that he had a rash on his body, and he remembered that this rash was like the one that he'd seen on baby A. And sadly, they worked on him for almost 50 minutes, and the doctors just couldn't save him, and he died in the early hours.
50 minutes of CPR on a tiny baby.
And obviously his parents were called in and they watched a lot of that process and sadly had to watch him slip away.
But we come back to the rash again that keeps coming up in this trial. Still at this point, the doctors and nurses were noticing it, but didn't know why it was there, didn't know what it meant, didn't know really that it was significant. But then there's a moment, isn't there, again, which is why we've picked this out from the podcast, because it was a bit of a turning point, really, in the doctors and nurses wondering what was going on. So one of the doctors in this case, a doctor called Ravi Jairam, he was a consultant. He started to research this rash.
Not till much later on, but yeah.
A lot later on, but he then realised that this rash could be a consequence, a sign of an air embolus.
Dr. Jairam said he didn't realise the clinical significance of the rash until months later, after more babies had died and it had been present in others who collapsed.
He said the research paper, which the jury heard is well known among paediatricians, examined the effect of air embolus, that's air in the circulation of newborns, and it described almost exactly the rash and the skin discoloration that was seen on the body of baby A.
I remember sitting on my sofa at home with the iPad, and I remember reading that description and the physical chill that went down my spine because it fitted with what we were seeing.
So it was at this point
Continued to work on this department for another 4 months or so. In retrospect, I wish we had bypassed them and gone straight to the police. We by no means were playing judge and jury at any point, but the association was becoming clearer and clearer. We were in an unprecedented situation. No one trains us for this. We were not thinking, could this be deliberate harm?
So obviously, back in June, July 2015, Dr. Jayram and Dr. Breary were having conversations. This association had been made because Lucy Letby seemed to always be there at these unexpected moments when babies were collapsing and dying. But then it was October the same year when these concerns started to escalate and other doctors were getting involved in these conversations, wasn't it?
So they said basically that they were talking to their colleagues, and this was a key part of the prosecution case, but it was also a key part of Lucy Letby's defence, because she said in court that 4 of these consultants in particular, the gang of 4 as they were termed in court, had it in for her essentially, and were trying to blame her for the failings at the hospital, for mistakes that were made and for the baby's deaths.
And actually, when she gave evidence later in the trial, that was the accusation she made to Nick Johnson, the prosecutor.
She named 4 consultants, Dr. Jayram, Dr. Stephen Breary, Dr. John Gibbs and Dr. B, a consultant we haven't been able to name, as being out to get her. She said the 4 were involved in a conspiracy to blame her for the baby's deaths.
You may also remember that she told the jury that when she'd written the word bastards on another of the notes, she was referring to Dr. Breary and Dr. Jayram because she was angry that they pointed the finger at her.
Are you suggesting there's some sort of agreement between medical staff to get you?
In the consultants group, I do believe, yes.
4 doctors, a gang of 4, let's call them. What's the conspiracy?
They have apportioned blame onto me.
The motive?
I believe to cover failings at the hospital.
And it was pointed out in court that actually the consultants did everything they could really to find a medical reason, a medical explanation for what was going on, because nobody really wanted to believe that one of their own was attacking babies and doing what they said was the unthinkable.
Yeah, and in fact, it was so unthinkable that Dr. Stephen Breary actually said, not Lucy, not nice Lucy, when this was suggested to him.
Because nobody wanted to believe it.
So the other reason that the court was told by the prosecutor that this allegation that the gang of four were out to get her was fanciful, according to the prosecutor, Nick Johnson, was because these four experienced consultants had ignored the key medical evidence in this case, which was the insulin, Liz.
Yeah, so when they went to the managers, they didn't actually know that 2 of the babies on the unit had already been poisoned. And Mr. Johnson pointed that out, saying, you know, it was amazing that they'd missed essentially the best bit of evidence against her. And it was only years later, when the police got involved and started investigating, that they actually unearthed these 2 blood samples that were taken 8 months apart, baby boys from 2 separate sets of twins that were poisoned 8 months apart, and the insulin was found to be in these blood samples, and it had to be insulin that was manufactured. It couldn't have been produced by them themselves.
No, it was given to them deliberately, and because they didn't need it, it was given to them to cause harm.
Do you agree that baby F was poisoned with insulin?
Yes.
Knowing what you know about insulin readings, blood sugar readings, what are the realistic possibilities in baby L's case?
I don't believe any member of the unit would make a mistake.
Mistake is not an option?
Yes.
Deliberate poisoning, but not you.
Insulin has been added by somebody, but not me.
So we know that attack on baby F came the day after his brother, baby E, was murdered. And that was a particularly moving moment in court, Liz. I remember the description of what happened there.
Yeah, so the manner of his attack was just horrendous. The way it was described in court, he was attacked by having what they think was a metal instrument shoved down his throat, which triggered this bleeding. And as they desperately tried to resuscitate him, he lost 1/4 of the blood in his body. And, you know, obviously that one of the doctors that was present there was describing this moment and was clearly traumatised by what he saw.
Doctors began full CPR when his heart stopped beating.
The court heard Dr. Harkness led the resuscitation efforts alongside nurses Caroline Oakley, Lucy Letby and another colleague, Belinda Williamson. Jurors were told the resuscitation was distressing because baby E continued to bleed profusely from his nose and mouth while the medical team desperately tried to save him.
Over the course of the next 47 minutes, with his parents close by, the medical team gave baby E 5 doses of adrenaline to try and stimulate his heart.
Yes, and unusually, like in the case of baby C, baby E's heartbeat returned momentarily just after 1 a.m. But by then he had been without oxygen for around 15 minutes, and doctors soon realised he was unlikely to survive.
CPR was stopped at around 1:23 a.m. and baby E was given to his parents to cuddle as he passed away. He was formally pronounced dead at 1:40 a.m.
Now, after he died, the initial thought from the doctors was that he died from natural causes. They advised the parents not to have a post-mortem, and that was a wrong decision, really.
Well, it was a really terrible mistake, and initially the consultant thought that he'd got some kind of stomach bleed due to a kind of bowel condition that premature babies get. But that was later disproved by the medical experts. So the decision not to have a post-mortem meant that actually, although they suspected that he'd been assaulted, like in the case of one of the triplets, baby O, who had a terrible liver injury, they couldn't actually prove that baby E had been assaulted. And when the consultant gave evidence in court, it produced a really dramatic moment.
Yes, in court the doctor turned to baby E's parents, who were sitting in the public gallery behind her, and publicly apologised for this. She said she regretted that decision, because obviously a post-mortem would have been very helpful in explaining exactly why baby E died.
The doctor went on to explain to the jury why she'd changed her mind about baby E's cause of death, and why she thought the bowel condition was no longer to blame.
Yeah, she said she'd since examined the results of blood tests and x-rays taken in the run-up to his death. She said his observations were very stable up until he collapsed, which didn't fit with what would have happened if he had had the bowel problem. She also said she'd failed to give enough weight to the x-ray, taken around an hour before his death, and had been normal.
So because there was no post-mortem for baby E, the prosecution didn't really have the medical evidence to prove that he had been assaulted, even though the evidence of the bleeding was pretty conclusive. But in the case of baby O, who was also, the prosecution said, viciously assaulted by Lucy Letby, it was a different matter because that was clear on the post-mortem records, wasn't it?
Yeah, so he had a post-mortem, and the post-mortem results were looked at by the prosecution's expert, Dr. Andreas Marnarides, who found a severe liver injury, which he said was akin really only to children he'd seen that suffered injuries in road traffic accidents.
And of course, baby O was a triplet. His brother was baby P, and they were both murdered by Lucy Letby within hours, actually, of her coming back onto the ward after she'd been on holiday to Ibiza. And in fact, what we also heard was that the prosecution say that she also planned to kill the third triplet, but he was moved off the ward.
His parents essentially begged doctors from the transport team when they arrived to take baby P. Sadly, he died, and they begged the doctors to take the surviving triplet out of the Countess to another hospital.
This baby boy was a triplet, and he and his two brothers were identical because they shared a placenta. Now, while triplets themselves are rare, identical triplets conceived naturally like these baby boys were are even more unusual. So rare, in fact, it happens in just 1 in 200 million births.
The prosecution say Lucy Letby didn't just murder baby O, she also killed his brother, baby P. She's accused of injecting both boys with air into their tummies and bloodstreams, causing them to collapse and die.
Statement to the court, the triplets' mother described what she'd witnessed.
On June 23rd, a doctor came onto the ward and said baby O's stomach had swollen and he was needing help to breathe, so they had put a tube down his throat, and lots of medical staff were rushing around. I remember the nurse Lucy was there all the time. The staff seemed to be in a state of panic. I just sat outside the nursery. I couldn't bring myself to go closer. My partner was closer to what was going on. Baby O kept arresting and he changed colour, which I saw later with baby P. He was swollen all over his body. Another doctor called Steve arrived. I think he was one of the main doctors. He told me that things weren't looking good for baby O, and if he did manage to survive, he would likely have brain damage, so it might be best if he didn't survive. This went on all afternoon, and eventually baby O passed away at about 5 p.m. This whole episode had come as a bolt out of the blue. On the face of it, everything seemed to be going so well for the triplets. It was never explained to us how the sudden downturn in baby O's health happened. As a family, we were naturally devastated.
And it was actually during baby P's deterioration when Lucy Letby made what one of her colleagues described was an absolutely shocking comment.
I remember saying the transport team are going to be here soon, almost thinking out loud. I was literally counting the minutes before they arrived. Staff nurse Letby said, "He's not leaving here alive, is he?" Which I found absolutely shocking at the time. I turned around and said, "Don't say that." All these years on, 7 years on, that memory is still very much alive in my mind.
Now obviously we know about that comment that was made. We know she liked the drama. We know she revelled in all of that drama. But what she also craved was the attention of a certain doctor who we called Dr. A because we couldn't name him during the trial. And he was described in court as her boyfriend, although she said they were just friends and that she loved him as a friend. But what we know is that he's married, but they texted long into the night on many occasions.
Yeah, so they went on trips to London together, he bought her chocolates, he let her use his car to get home. And actually the first time that we saw any emotion from her was when he came to give evidence and stepped into the witness box for the first time, and she broke down in tears and she actually tried to leave the dock.
But as soon as he gave his name to the court, Lucy Letby became tearful and stood up from her seat. She appeared to try to leave the glass-panelled dock via the doors which leads to the cells.
The trial judge, Mr. Justice Goss, watched the drama unfold and asked Lucy Letby's solicitor to just see what the problem is. She had a hushed conversation with the dock officer and her solicitor before composing herself, although she did continue to wipe her eyes with a tissue as the doctor started to give his evidence.
The jury was not given an explanation for her reaction, and the doctor was allowed to continue with his evidence.
Were you in love with him?
No, I loved Dr. A as a friend. I wasn't in love with him.
One of the theories put to the jury was that Lucy Letby attacked babies in order to get Dr. A into the room, to get his attention. Yes, we already knew that on a number of occasions when babies on the unit collapsed, it was Dr. A who was crash bleeped to attend. What Mr. Johnson has now alleged to the court is that Lucy Letby murdered and deliberately harmed some of the children in order to get Dr. A into the room.
Did you enjoy being in these crisis situations with Dr. A?
No.
Did it give you something to talk to him about and message him about?
No, Dr. A and I were friends.
Something in common you could share?
No.
And it was after the deaths of baby O
of the triplets. Because concerns had reached a tipping point, safety measures were introduced, and one of the key safety measures which the consultants were insistent on was Lucy Letby be removed from the neonatal unit. That was not a simple, straightforward decision. A month later, senior managers wanted staff nurse Letby to come back on the unit, and we said that should only happen if CCTV was put in each room in the unit.
Finally, in July 2018, Lucy Letby was arrested. She was arrested in a dawn raid by police from Cheshire at her home in Chester, just a couple of miles from the hospital. And at that point, her house was searched, as was the home of her parents, who lived in Hereford.
And in these police searches, they found what they described as a treasure trove of information, medical documents, post-it notes, and pictures of cards on her phone that she'd written. And in Baby I's case, they found a condolence card that she actually sent to her parents on the day of her funeral.
There are no words to make this time any easier. It was a real privilege to care for Baby I and get to know you as a family who always put Baby I first and did everything possible for her. She will always be a part of your lives, and we will never forget her. Thinking of you today and always. Sorry I cannot be there to say goodbye.
It's a weird thing to do, to take a picture of a card and keep it on your phone for years. Was there any clue why?
She just said that she did that routinely with cards that she sent to people because she wanted to remember what she'd written. And there was another card on her phone, which was a thank you card that the parents of Baby E and Baby F had actually sent to all the nurses on the unit to say thank you when Baby F was well enough to go home. And that was also found on her phone.
And actually, these souvenirs, the police called them, or killing trophies, they didn't end there, did they?
Detective Constable Colin Johnson is an exhibits officer with Cheshire Police. Now, he was called to give evidence and took the jury through what police discovered at Lucy Letby's 3-bedroom semi in the Blacon suburb of Chester.
One of the most dramatic moments so far in the court case has been a post-it note. This was found at Lucy Letby's home during a police search. Why was this such a big moment in the case?
Yeah, this was a key moment, Caroline. The jury was shown the scribbled post-it note on screens in the courtroom. It was found at her home in Chester. In the note, she describes herself as evil. The note also said, "I did this, I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." She also wrote, "I will never have children or marry or know what it's like to have a family." But she also had written, "I haven't done anything wrong and I feel very alone and scared."
There are no words. I am an awful person. I pay every day for that. I can't breathe. I can't focus. Kill myself right now. Overwhelming fear, panic. I'll never have children or marry. I'll never know what it's like to have a family. No hope. I haven't done anything wrong. I don't deserve to live. I did this. Why me? I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough for them, and I'm a horrible, evil person. I don't deserve Mum and Dad. World is better off without me.
So, I am evil, I did this. There's the confession, yeah?
Well, that's what the prosecution said. The defence said that it wasn't a confession. They said that it was written by Lucy Letby when she was moved off the unit, out of the job she said she loved, into the admin role, because she felt isolated, because she felt anxiety, she was upset, and they said it was the anguished outpourings of a woman who felt destroyed by losing her job.
But also, if all that's true, at this point, she knew she was being investigated by the police. They'd spoken to colleagues at the hospital, so they knew that word was getting back to her. Why keep them?
Well, that's the big question. The police actually think that she kept them on purpose, potentially for them to find. They can't work out why they would be in the house so many months after she knew that she was being investigated.
The yellow post-it note contained the first names of the triplets involved in the case, and underneath had been written, "Today is your birthday, but you aren't here, and I'm so sorry for that. I'm sorry you couldn't have the chance at life, and for the pain. I can't do this anymore."
The court heard that police found the log, along with a blood test report for Baby M, in a plastic supermarket carrier bag under Lucy Letby's bed when they searched her home, close to the hospital.
She told detectives she must have forgotten to empty her pockets before leaving work and inadvertently taken the paper towel home. She said it may have been put to one side and forgotten about, but she denied keeping it as a reminder of an attack on Baby M.
A 6-year investigation, a court case lasting the best part of a year. rafts and rafts of evidence, as we've seen, that implicate Lucy Letby in the murders and attempted murders of these babies. Strange, odd behaviour throughout this period. And yet, between 2015 and 2016, when all of this was going on, no one noticed that she was behaving oddly.
Because she wasn't behaving oddly or strangely at work, she was a really competent nurse. You know, you've seen the pictures of her. She's, you know, she looks like the girl next door. There's nothing remarkable about her at all. She was a killer